Elias Rowan had played only 7 notes when the chairman's son ordered security to remove him from the gala. The first notes of the old piano piece had barely reached the crystal balconies of the Armitage Grand Hall when Julian Armitage stepped away from the head table and raised one hand. "Stop!" The string players seated behind Elias lowered their bows. Conversation faded across the ballroom. Nearly 400 guests turned toward the black grand piano beneath the stage lights. Elias remained seated. He was 42, tall and slender, with short black hair and a calm face that rarely revealed what he was feeling. He wore a plain black tuxedo provided by the event agency, although he had replaced its cheap plastic buttons with polished horn buttons the night before. His hands rested lightly over the keys. Julian crossed the dance floor with the confidence of a man who had never needed to explain why a room should obey him. At 38, he was the expected heir to Armitage Atlantic, a global shipping, insurance, and hospitality empire founded almost 80 years earlier. He wore a white dinner jacket, a black bow tie, and the gold lapel pin reserved for members of the Armitage family board. "This selection was not approved," Julian said. Elias looked toward the printed program beside the piano. "It was requested by your grandmother." "My grandmother is 91 and occasionally confuses memories with instructions." At the head table, Beatrice Armitage sat motionless in a silver wheelchair. Her white hair was arranged neatly beneath a jeweled comb. She had not spoken publicly in months, but her dark eyes remained sharp. Elias turned toward her. Beatrice lifted 2 fingers from the armrest. "Continue." Julian saw the gesture and stepped closer to the piano. "The program calls for Schubert." "The written program does," Elias replied. "Mrs. Armitage asked for this piece during rehearsal." "What piece is it?" "Morning over Calder Street." The title meant nothing to most of the guests. It meant something to Beatrice. Her hand tightened around the wheelchair arm. Julian's mother, Lenora Armitage, leaned toward her son and whispered urgently. Julian ignored her. "Who gave you permission to speak with my grandmother privately?" "She spoke to me while I was tuning the piano." "You were hired to perform, not to involve yourself with the family." "I didn't involve myself. She requested a song." Julian glanced around the ballroom. Investors, diplomats, museum directors, and journalists were watching. The gala celebrated the 75th anniversary of Armitage Atlantic. A large illuminated display behind the stage showed the company's official founders, Julian's late grandfather, Percival Armitage, and Percival's older brother, Edmund. The family had spent months preparing the evening. A pianist refusing instructions was becoming a distraction. Julian forced a smile. "Mr. Rowan. Mr. Rowan, please return to the approved program." Elias looked at Beatrice again. She raised her fingers once more. "Continue." He placed his hands over the keys. Julian closed the piano lid. The sound echoed through the ballroom. Elias pulled his hands back before the polished wood struck them. Several guests gasped. Beatrice's nurse rose behind the wheelchair. Julian lowered his voice. "You are finished." Elias stood slowly. "I was hired for the full evening." "You are no longer employed." "The musician's contract requires cause." "You ignored the event director and publicly challenged a member of the host family. That is sufficient." "It wasn't the event director who stopped me." Julian's expression hardened. "No, it was the man paying you." Elias looked around the ballroom. "No," he said. "The foundation is paying the musicians." A few board members exchanged glances. The Armitage Cultural Foundation had hired the orchestra, not Julian personally. Julian turned toward Security Chief Bram Coulter. "Remove him." 2 security officers approached the stage. Elias did not resist. He closed the sheet music and placed it inside a worn leather folder. As he stepped away from the piano, Beatrice struck the silver handle of her cane against the floor. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound was small, but the guests nearest her heard it. Julian faced his grandmother. "You need to rest." Beatrice lifted her chin and forced out one word. "Stay." The room became silent again. It was the clearest word she had spoken in weeks. Julian walked to her and crouched beside the wheelchair. "Grandmother, the pianist is leaving because he ignored the program." Her eyes moved past him toward Elias. "Rowan," she whispered. Elias stopped. Julian followed her gaze. "You know him?" Beatrice struggled to speak again, but her voice failed. Her nurse checked her pulse and asked for space. Lenora stood quickly. "Take Mother upstairs." The nurse began moving the wheelchair toward a private elevator. As Beatrice passed Elias, she reached from beneath her shawl and caught the edge of his sleeve. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Diary," she whispered. Then she released him. Julian heard the word. So did Elias. Security escorted Elias through a side corridor while the orchestra director apologized repeatedly to the Armitage family. The string players began Schubert 5 minutes later, but the evening had changed. Guests whispered about Beatrice's reaction. Reporters asked assistants whether the pianist was connected to the family. Julian instructed the press office to describe the incident as a misunderstanding involving an unprofessional performer. By midnight, Elias's contract had been canceled. By morning, 3 other gala bookings disappeared from his schedule. The Armitage family had not publicly accused him of misconduct, but the event agency told clients he had disrupted a billionaire's celebration and caused distress to an elderly guest. Elias returned to the narrow apartment he shared with his mother, Miriam Rowan, and placed the leather music folder on the kitchen table. Miriam was 68 and moved carefully because of arthritis in her hips. She had once worked as a music teacher, church organist, and hotel pianist, often holding all 3 jobs in the same year. A framed photograph of her younger self stood above the upright piano near the window. She looked at Elias's face. "What happened?" "They removed me." "Why?" "I played Morning over Calder Street." Miriam became still. "Who asked you to play it?" "Beatrice Armitage." The color left her face. Elias noticed. "You know her." Miriam turned toward the kettle, though it had already begun boiling. "I know the name." She knew ours. The kettle continued screaming. Elias switched it off. She grabbed my sleeve and said, "Diary." Miriam lowered herself into a chair. For several seconds, she looked older than she had the night before. "Your grandmother wrote that song," she said. Elias sat opposite her. "You told me you wrote it." "I arranged it. My mother composed the melody." Elias had known his grandmother only through fragments. Viola Rowan died when he was 5. Miriam described her as a gifted pianist who spent most of her life working in hotels and private homes because conservatories rarely admitted black women from poor families when she was young. "Why would Beatrice Armitage know grandmother's music?" Miriam looked toward the old photograph. "Because your grandmother helped build their company." Elias waited for her to explain. Instead, Miriam rose and walked to the upright piano. She opened the bench and removed a flat wooden box from beneath several books of sheet music. Inside were letters tied with green ribbon, faded photographs, and share certificates from a company called Calder Street Shipping Cooperative. The oldest photograph showed 3 young adults standing outside a warehouse near the harbor. One was Percival Armitage. Another was a man Elias did not recognize. The third was Viola Rowan. She stood between them wearing a dark dress and holding an account ledger against her chest. On the warehouse wall behind them were painted words, "Calder Street Shipping, Armitage, Bell, and Rowan." Elias read the names twice. "Who is Bell?" "Jonas Bell, a dock supervisor. He died before the company became famous." "And grandmother?" "She was the bookkeeper, translator, investor, and the person who found their first clients." Miriam returned to the table and arranged the papers carefully. In 1948, Percival Armitage had no empire. He was 27, recently returned from military service, and deeply in debt after inheriting 2 damaged cargo boats from an uncle. His brother Edmund had connections but refused to invest until the business became safer. Jonas Bell knew the harbor. Viola Rowan knew numbers. She had worked at a shipping office where she learned freight insurance, customs documents, and foreign correspondence. She spoke French and Portuguese well enough to communicate with merchants ignored by larger firms. Percival had boats, Jonas had workers. Viola had the system that made the company possible. She invested nearly all the money inherited from her father, $11,000, more than Percival possessed in cash. The three signed an agreement dividing the first shares. Percival received 45%, Viola received 35%, Jonas received 20%. The certificates inside Miriam's box showed only a small portion of Viola's original interest. Most had supposedly been exchanged years later. Supposedly, Elias asked. Miriam opened one of the letters. After Jonas died, Percival reorganized the company. He told Mother that banks would not finance a shipping firm partly controlled by a black woman. So she sold her shares? She agreed to place them inside a private trust until the financing closed. Did they return them? No. According to the Armitage family's public history, Percival founded the company with financial support from Edmund. Viola disappeared from the story. She continued working at Calder Street for several years, officially listed as an accounts secretary. When she demanded proof that her shares remained protected, Percival told her the original agreement had been replaced. Viola threatened legal action. Then Miriam became ill with rheumatic fever. Hospital care was expensive. Viola needed money immediately. Percival offered enough to cover treatment if she signed a settlement acknowledging that she had been an employee, not a founder. She signed? Elias asked. Miriam shook her head. She signed a receipt for the medical payment. Their lawyer later attached it to a different agreement and claimed she surrendered everything. Did she fight? She tried. Viola found an attorney willing to take the case, but the attorney died before filing suit. Documents disappeared. Jonas's widow moved away. Percival became wealthier and more powerful. Viola kept writing letters. Most were ignored. One was answered by Beatrice Armitage. At that time, Beatrice was Percival's young wife and had recently begun managing the company's charitable work. She met Viola privately and believed her. What did Beatrice do? Elias asked. She promised to find the original founder's diary. Whose diary? Percival's. Percival documented the company's first years in a series of leather journals. Viola had seen him record their investments, early losses, and share distributions. If those entries survived, they would prove she owned the first shares. Beatrice searched. Then Percival discovered the meetings. He forbade his wife from contacting Viola and threatened to remove Beatrice's access to their children. In those years, Beatrice possessed social status but little independent power. She chose her family, Miriam said. And grandmother? She chose not to beg them again. Viola continued playing music wherever she could. Morning over Calder Street began as a melody she composed during the company's first profitable month. Percival once called it their victory song. After the betrayal, she never performed it publicly. Miriam had not told Elias the truth because she possessed no original founder agreement and did not want him to build his life around a grievance he could not prove. What about these certificates? He asked. They prove she bought early shares. The Armitages would say they were redeemed. And the diary? I never saw it. Elias looked at the letters. Beatrice knows where it is. Miriam folded her hands. Or she once did. At Hawthorne House, Beatrice Armitage refused breakfast. She also refused to see Julian. She communicated through a small writing tablet, though her right hand trembled. When Lenora entered the bedroom, Beatrice had written one name, Elias Rowan. Lenora sat beside the bed. Who is he? Beatrice wrote another name. Viola Lenora's face tightened. She had heard the name before, not from the company history, but during arguments between her parents when she was a child. Percival once accused Beatrice of allowing that Rowan woman to poison her against him. Lenora had never understood the reference. Was Viola Rowan an employee? Beatrice struck the tablet with the stylus. Then she wrote, Founder. Lenora stared at the word. The Armitage family's fortune, identity, and board authority rested partly on founder shares passed from Percival to his descendants. If Viola owned an undisclosed share, the legal consequences could reach across decades of dividends and inheritance transfers. "Where is the evidence?" Beatrice wrote. "Diary, blue room, false piano." Lenora read the words twice. The blue room was part of the original Armitage residence, now preserved inside the company's private historical archive. It contained Percival's first desk, maps, and an antique square piano that no longer worked. "What does false piano mean?" Beatrice closed her eyes. Lenora asked again. Her mother did not respond. Julian entered without knocking. "Why is the family doctor here?" "Mother is tired." She was healthy enough to interrupt the gala. Beatrice opened her eyes and looked at him coldly. Julian noticed the writing tablet. "What is that?" Lenora turned it over. "Nothing." He walked closer. "Is this about the pianist?" Beatrice lifted one hand and pointed toward the door. Julian smiled without warmth. "You embarrassed the family last night for a stranger." Beatrice's nurse stepped forward. "She needs rest." Julian ignored her. "Who is Viola Rowan?" Lenora looked at him sharply. "How do you know that name?" "Grandmother said Rowan. Our archives director found a reference to Viola Rowan in early payroll records." Beatrice began writing again. Julian reached for the tablet. Lenora took it first. "Leave. I am acting chairman. If someone is preparing a claim against the company, I need to know. You are not acting chairman until the board votes next month. Father's condition makes the vote a formality." Julian's father, Alton Armitage, had suffered a severe stroke the previous year and remained in long-term care. Julian had assumed increasing control since then. Lenora stood. "You removed a musician from a gala because you disliked a song. Do not mistake that for control of the company." Julian looked toward his grandmother. "This family has survived accusations before." Beatrice forced out two words. "Not truth." Julian left the bedroom. He went directly to the archive director. Elias received a call from an unknown number that afternoon. The caller introduced herself as Lenora Armitage. "My mother wishes to see you." Elias looked across the kitchen at Miriam. "Does your son know you are calling?" There was a pause. "Julian does not control my telephone. He controlled my employment. I cannot reverse what happened publicly without understanding the connection. You know enough to call." Lenora lowered her voice. "My mother wrote that your grandmother was a founder." Miriam heard the words through the speaker and closed her eyes. Elias asked, "Do you believe her?" "I believe she believes it." "That is a careful answer." "It is the answer I can give before seeing evidence. We have certificates and letters." "I have a woman who says there is a diary." Elias looked at his mother. Miriam shook her head slightly. She did not trust the family. Neither did he. "We will meet in the presence of an attorney," Elias said. Lenora agreed. The attorney Elias contacted was Sloan Ketteridge, a former corporate archivist who later became a lawyer specializing in historical ownership cases. Sloan was 54, precise, impatient with dramatic claims, and deeply interested the moment she examined Viola's certificates. "These are genuine," she said, "but they do not establish the final ownership position. We need the founder agreement, transfer documents, or contemporaneous records showing the shares were never legally surrendered. There may be a diary. Diaries are useful, but courts prefer contracts. Percival's diary may describe the contract. Then it can support the claim and help locate other records." The meeting with Beatrice took place in a private medical suite with Lenora present. Julian was not invited. When Elias entered, Beatrice reached toward him. This time he took her hand. "You knew my grandmother," he said. Beatrice nodded. Miriam placed Viola's photograph on the table. Beatrice touched it with trembling fingers. Tears formed in her eyes. "Sorry," she whispered. Miriam remained standing. You had 70 years to say that. Lenora looked toward her mother, startled by the directness. Beatrice did not become defensive. She nodded again. I failed. Miriam sat opposite her. What happened to Percival's diary? Beatrice wrote slowly on the tablet. After Percival's death, she found 3 journals inside his locked office. The second journal documented Viola's money, Jonas's share, and the first company agreement. Percival admitted that the later transfer document had been altered after Viola signed only the medical receipt. Beatrice planned to send the journal to Miriam. Before she could, Edmund Armitage discovered it. He told Beatrice the company could collapse if Viola's ownership became public. Banks might call loans, investors might sue, thousands of employees could lose work. Beatrice believed him. Again, the family used other people's livelihoods to make dishonesty sound responsible. She hid the journal rather than surrendering it. Inside the Blue Room stood an antique piano built for appearance rather than performance. Its lower panel contained a narrow storage compartment once used for music rolls. Beatrice placed the diary there. Only she and Percival knew the panel existed. Why didn't you retrieve it later? Elias asked. Beatrice wrote, Edmund sealed archive. Then fear, then years. Miriam read the sentence. Fear became habit. Beatrice looked at her and nodded. Sloane requested immediate legal preservation of the Blue Room and its contents. Before the court could issue the order, Julian entered the company archive with 2 security officers and director Orson Vale. He claimed he needed to inspect artifacts after learning that a performer might be connected to a fraudulent founder allegation. Orson protested. Julian reminded him that the Armitage family controlled his budget and employment. They entered the Blue Room. The antique piano stood against the far wall beneath a portrait of Percival. Julian found the lower compartment. It was empty. The next morning, he issued a public statement. The Armitage family had discovered that Elias Rowan and his representatives were preparing a false historical claim based on the stories of a former employee. The company described Viola as a respected bookkeeper who received fair compensation. It also announced that no founder's diary supporting her claim existed. Sloane read the statement in her office. How can he know the diary does not exist unless he searched for it? Lenora called minutes later. The compartment is empty. Elias stood beside the window. Who entered the room? Julian, the archive director, and security. Was the room recorded? Lenora hesitated. The internal cameras were offline for maintenance. Sloane looked up. Of course they were. The court granted an emergency preservation order that afternoon. The archive was sealed. Investigators copied access logs and employee communications. Julian insisted he found nothing inside the piano. Orson Vale supported him initially. Security officers claimed they remained near the door and never saw a diary. The case appeared to depend on the memory of a 91-year-old woman and papers the company could explain away. Then Beatrice remembered something else. She had not placed the diary inside the compartment alone. Her personal maid at the time, Maribel Say, helped wrap it in waxed cloth. Maribel would now be nearly 100 years old if still living. Sloane found her daughter. Maribel had died 12 years earlier, but she left boxes of letters and cassette recordings for her children. In one recording made shortly before her death, she described helping Mrs. Armitage hide the blue book that proved the colored pianist owned the company. Maribel also said Beatrice added a copy of the original share ledger and placed both inside the piano. The phrase changed everything, not only a diary, a share ledger. Company ledgers were legal business records, not personal reflections. Sloane investigated the piano itself. It had been restored 8 years earlier by a specialist named Corbin Dallow. Corbin remembered finding a wrapped package inside the lower panel. He did not open it. Orson Vale instructed him to place it inside a numbered archive box while the piano was repaired. The box number was 8-441. Company records listed 8-441 as containing obsolete hotel menus. The box could not be found. The inventory showed it had been transferred from the central archive to executive storage 4 months earlier. The authorization bore Julian's electronic signature. Julian claimed his assistant had processed the transfer automatically. His assistant denied it. Investigators searched executive storage under court supervision. Box 8-441 was missing, but a shipping label had been created for a private Armitage warehouse 2 days after the gala. The package description read, "Historical paper materials for destruction." The transport driver, Keenan Moss, remembered the box because Julian personally called him and changed the destination midway through the trip. Instead of the warehouse, Keenan delivered it to Julian's private country residence. Police obtained a warrant. They searched the residence. The diary was not in the study, office, or safe. They found ashes inside an outdoor incinerator, but forensic experts could not immediately determine what had been burned. Julian's attorneys accused Sloan of turning a family disagreement into a criminal spectacle. Then investigators examined the estate's smart home records. At 2:14 the morning after the gala, Julian entered a climate-controlled wine room. He remained there for 19 minutes. The wine room contained a locked cabinet disguised as part of the wall. Inside it, police found the blue leather diary. Julian had not burned it. He had burned old financial papers to create the appearance that the evidence was destroyed while keeping the diary for leverage. The waxed cloth remained around it. Beside the diary lay the original Calder Street share ledger. On the first page were 3 names: Percival Armitage, 45%, Viola Rowan, 35%, Jonas Bell, 20%. Each entry carried a signature. Further pages recorded capital contributions, profit distributions, and the temporary transfer of Viola's shares into a trust controlled by Percival. The transfer was explicitly temporary. No later page showed her surrendering ownership. Percival's diary explained why. In an entry dated March 3, 1952, he wrote that Viola refused to sell. He admitted instructing company attorney Silas Crane to attach her signature from a medical receipt to a separate release. "I told myself I was preserving the company," Percival wrote. "The truth is that I was preserving my authority. Viola saved Miriam, and I used the child's illness to make the mother appear paid." Another entry described Beatrice confronting him. She said the ships moved because Viola made the numbers honest. I answered that ships do not care whose name is on the paper. Beatrice said people do. The final relevant entry was written years later. Percival admitted Viola remained the lawful owner of the founder shares and that dividends belonging to her family had been redirected into Armitage-controlled accounts. The evidence did more than reveal an old injustice. It proved continuing fraud. The company had issued shares, mergers, and inheritances based on a false ownership structure. Viola's 35% would have been diluted over decades, but it still represented a significant stake in Armitage Atlantic, potentially billions. Julian was arrested for concealment of evidence, obstruction, and violating the court's preservation order. He continued claiming he intended to protect the company until lawyers could verify the diary. Sloan asked one question during his deposition: "Why did you announce publicly that no diary existed?" Julian looked toward his attorney. "I believed it was unreliable." "You said it did not exist." "I was speaking generally." "You transferred it, removed it from the archive, hid it inside your home, and burned unrelated papers after a preservation request. Which of those actions was general?" Julian did not answer. The family divided. Lenora supported an independent investigation and resigned from the family-controlled board committee. Her brother, Quentin Armitage, accused her of betraying their father's memory. Beatrice recorded a public statement. Her voice was weak, so Lenora read the words while Beatrice sat beside her. Viola Rowan was not an employee who received unusual generosity. She was a founder who received unusual betrayal. I knew enough to help and chose silence because the truth threatened my home, my children, and the version of my husband I wanted to preserve. My fear does not equal Percival's fraud, but it helped the fraud survive. Miriam watched the statement from Elias's apartment. When it ended, she did not cry. "She finally said it," Elias said. She said it after the police found what she hid. You wanted her to confess. I wanted my mother not to die believing no one powerful would ever admit what happened. The ownership trial lasted nearly a year. Armitage Atlantic argued that Viola's claims had expired under limitation laws and that later corporate changes made restoration impossible. Sloan argued that limitation periods could not protect ongoing fraud deliberately concealed by the controlling family. The court agreed that Viola never legally surrendered her founder interest. Financial experts reconstructed decades of transactions. Jonas Bell's descendants were also located and joined the case after discovering that his shares had been acquired through a separate deceptive agreement. The final settlement restructured the company rather than destroying it. A Rowan family trust received a substantial ownership stake, unpaid dividends, and voting rights. The Bell descendants received their restored interest. The Armitage family retained shares reflecting Percival's lawful portion but lost absolute control. An independent board replaced the hereditary leadership system. Julian resigned from every company position and later pleaded guilty to obstruction. His sentence included prison time because he had knowingly hidden evidence after a court preservation request. Quentin left the company. Lenora remained only as a non-executive board representative and supported the reforms. Beatrice transferred most of her personal wealth into a fund for overlooked founders and early employees whose work had been removed from corporate histories. She did not name the fund after herself. Miriam insisted on that condition. Armitage Atlantic changed its historical display. The illuminated portrait showing Percival and Edmund as the two founders was removed. In its place appeared a photograph of the Calder Street warehouse. Below it were three names: Percival Armitage, Viola Rowan Jonas Bell. The company's anniversary film was rewritten. It explained that Percival supplied vessels and business connections, Jonas organized cruise and harbor operations, and Viola invested capital, built the accounting system, secured international clients, and composed the music played during the company's first celebrations. Elias was invited to perform at the reopening of the historical hall. He refused the company's first offer. It sounds like they want the man removed from the Gala to return for a perfect ending, he told Sloan. Miriam disagreed. They want the music. They had the music and removed me. Then play it under the correct name. The performance took place 1 year after the scandal. There were no champagne towers or staged founder speeches. Employees, descendants, historians, and retired dock workers filled the hall. Beatrice attended in her wheelchair. Miriam sat in the front row. Elias walked to the same black piano from which Julian had removed him. This time, no one closed the lid. He placed Viola's original handwritten score on the music stand. The page had yellowed at the edges. Her name appeared at the top in dark ink, Mourning over Calder Street, Viola Rowan. Before playing, Elias spoke briefly. My grandmother wrote this when the first company ship returned with enough profit to pay every worker and every debt. For decades, the melody survived more clearly than her ownership. Tonight, both have their proper name. He began with the 7 notes Julian had interrupted. Beatrice closed her eyes. Miriam gripped the edge of her chair. The melody unfolded slowly, then grew stronger. It carried the sound of harbor bells, early trains, and waves striking warehouse walls. It was not triumphant in the simple way people expected victory music to be. There was hope inside it, but also labor, patience, and the knowledge that building something did not guarantee being remembered for it. When Elias finished, the room remained silent for several seconds. Then Miriam stood. Others followed. The applause rose around the piano. Elias looked toward Beatrice. She did not ask forgiveness again. She placed one hand over her heart and bowed her head. That was enough for the moment. After the ceremony, workers removed the temporary music stand. Elias noticed the piano lid remained open. Lenora approached him. The board would like to establish a permanent artist position in Viola's name. Will the artist be expected to play only approved pieces? Lenora accepted the rebuke. No. What happens when the music makes the family uncomfortable? There is no longer one family controlling the program. Elias considered the offer but did not accept the position himself. Instead, he helped create the Viola Rowan Fellowship for musicians whose families had been excluded from institutions they helped build. Miriam donated the letters and original score to an independent museum on permanent loan. She refused to place them solely inside the company archive. "They disappeared once inside an Armitage building," she said. "History should not depend on the family it embarrasses." Years later, visitors to the restored Calder Street warehouse could see the first share ledger through protective glass. Viola's name stood between Percival's and Jonas's in the same dark ink used nearly 80 years earlier. Beside it was Percival's diary, open to the page where he admitted the fraud. The museum did not hide his contribution. It did not soften his betrayal either. Elias often brought students there. One young pianist asked why Viola continued composing after the company erased her. Elias looked at the old score. "Because they could control the shares, the newspapers, and the building," he said. "They could not decide whether the music remained true." The Armitage family removed Elias from the Gala because they believed he was merely a hired black pianist who had forgotten his place. But Beatrice recognized the melody. The diary revealed that his mother, Miriam, had inherited a claim the family had spent generations concealing, and that Viola Rowan had owned 35 of the company's first shares before wealth made the Armitages powerful enough to rewrite the beginning. Elias had entered the ballroom as entertainment. He returned as the grandson of a founder, and the 7 notes they tried to silence became the sound that forced an empire to remember who had truly helped build it.